Alrighty, hello and welcome to another installment of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Melissa Howes-Whitecross, and I'd like to welcome all of our viewers tuning in through Zoom and Facebook Live tonight. If you're joining us for the first time, here's a quick Zoom 101. Zoom allows you to communicate with us through the chat room as well as the Q&A box, and you can find those icons on your Zoom screen. You can type your questions during the webinar into the Q&A box at any time, and our speakers will answer these at the end of the webinar. If you're tuning in on Facebook Live, you can also send us your questions and comments, and we'll be sure to feed these to the speakers during the question and answer session at the end. Let us know if you're tuning in tonight using the hashtag Conservation Conversations on whichever social media platform is your favorite, and be sure to catch up on any of the previous Conservation Conversations webinars that you may have missed on our BirdLife South Africa YouTube channel. During these tough economic times, we really do appreciate any and all donations that many of you have so generously sent through to us using the Cricket QR code. You can scan that QR code using any generic QR code reader, and it will direct you to the Cricket Donations website. Your contributions help to keep this webinar platform free for all to learn and enjoy, and we really do value the support received so far. The QR code is also available on our website if you happen to miss it during the webinar. BirdLife South Africa has an exciting offer for any new members who are signing up by watching our webinars. If you send in your membership application form before 5 p.m. on any Wednesday after our Tuesday webinars, you will also receive a free Bird of the Year pin badge with your subscription. And these really are turning into collector's items. So if you haven't gotten yours yet, make sure to get it with your subscription to BirdLife South Africa. Time is running out to enter our jackpot birding competition, where you stand a chance to win a 100,000 Rand cash prize by purchasing a 500 Rand ticket. Entries close this Sunday, the 12th of July. So make sure if you haven't gotten your ticket yet that you get onto our website and find all the details there to register. It's a new month, and that also means that it is a new chance to win the Jacana Media monthly giveaway competition. Last week, Jim Rankin walked away with 3 fantastic titles from Jacana Media, and this month we have a new selection for a lucky viewer to take home. Be sure to visit our Conservation Conversations website to find the link and enter. Now tonight, I am very excited to welcome BirdLife South Africa's White-winged Flufftail research team. Dr. Hanneline Smit-Robinson, Head of Conservation at BirdLife South Africa, has driven BirdLife South Africa's White-winged Flufftail project over the past decade. Robin Colyn, Manager of the Science and Innovation Program, has been responsible for unlocking some of the biological mysteries surrounding this elusive wetland bird over the past 5 years, including the discovery of its call and breeding behaviour in South Africa. And Dr. Kyle Lloyd, the Rockjumper Fellow of White-winged Flufftail Conservation, has started in his new role since April this year, and will be sharing some of the exciting future work planned for the conservation of this critically endangered bird. I'd also like to give a big welcome to Adam Riley, who is the Managing Director of Rockjumper Birding Tours, who so generously sponsor Kyle's work at BirdLife South Africa in collaboration with BirdLife International. And he will be making a guest appearance in tonight's webinar. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us tonight, and we are really looking forward to this conservation conversation with you. And I'm going to ask Hanneline just to share her screen now so that we can get underway. So over to you, Hanneline and team, and I'll speak to you all at the end of this.
Hi, Melissa, and hi, everybody else. Lovely to join you tonight, and it's really a great pleasure to talk about one of my absolute favorite species in the world, the white-winged flufftail. So I'm going to be talking to you, well, starting off, and then Robin's going to follow, and then Kyle will follow on after that. And we're going to tell you about the conservation story, 3 decades of conservation for the white-winged flufftail. So before I start, I usually, when I have to speak to an audience, I usually ask people, please show your hand. By show of hand, tell me whether you've seen a white-winged flufftail. Now, unfortunately, that's going to be a little bit more tricky tonight. But just looking at the comments that we received in the chat box earlier, I can sort of gauge that not many people on the webinar tonight have seen a white-winged flufftail. So I'm not only going to be talking to you about one of Africa's rarest species, but also one of Africa's most elusive species. So let me start with a little bit of background on the white-winged flufftail. So the white-winged flufftail is one of 9 flufftail species in the world. It's part of the Ceruthidae. It's an African family, and it's closely related to rails and kraits. So 7 of those species are found on the African continent, and another 2 occur in Madagascar. And that's the distribution of the white-winged flufftail in Africa. So you'll see there that Ethiopia, there's a big red dot there. So that's 3 sites in Ethiopia where the white-winged flufftail is known to occur and also to breed. And then all the way down south, 4,000 kilometers south in South Africa, up to now, we've recorded about 15 sites where white-winged flufftails are found in South Africa. And then you'll see 2 erratic records in between in Zimbabwe and in Zambia. So the connection between Ethiopia and South Africa is not well understood at all. And for the past 3 decades, we've been trying to sort this out and understand it better. And up to tonight, we can't give you a definite answer about what is that actual connection. Is it migratory? What happens? Because the birds are breeding in Ethiopia, and most of our records are from the summer in South Africa. But I've also said I'm going to tell you about the history and the conservation history of the species. So I'd like to start with and just say that those of us that's working on the white-winged flufftail now are following in the footsteps of giants in the conservation world. And really, if it wasn't for Dion Coetzee, we probably wouldn't be sitting here tonight talking about white-winged flufftail conservation. So tonight's webinar is a tribute and also dedicated to the late Dion Coetzee. Dion sadly passed away at the age of 88 earlier this year on the 1st of April. And I'm going to give you just a little bit of background on how Dion got involved with the white-winged flufftail. So Dion was a member of the Sandton Bird Club and then went birding with Warwick Tarberton in the Dullstroom area. And they were traveling to Middelpunt, and at Middelpunt they saw white-winged flufftail. And after that, Dion was very concerned about Middelpunt wetland and the actual state of the wetland. So they also spoke to Malcolm Drummond at the time, another member of Sandton Bird Club and also one of BirdLife South Africa's previous chairpersons. And together, the 3 of them then started the Middelpunt Wetland Trust with Dion and Malcolm 2 years later, formalizing the trust with Dr. Warwick Tarberton. And I know you all know that Warwick is an absolute giant in the ornithological world, with Warwick being their scientific advisor. And then in 1994, the trust was formalized and also the lease agreement signed for Middelpunt Wetland with the Dullstroom Trout Farm. So about another 3 years later, the first trip was done to Ethiopia with the support of the Middelpunt Wetland Trust, and that was done by Dr. Barry Taylor. So Barry went to Ethiopia and he described the first nesting records of the breeding white-winged flufftails, and shortly after that, David Allen got involved, both with scientific surveys in South Africa as well as in Ethiopia. So I apologize, not the best quality of photo, but I couldn't resist adding it in. This photo was taken at Burger Wetland in Ethiopia, early days, so probably around 1999. Dion then the center of the photo, Warwick Tarberton to the left, and then Malcolm Drummond on the right of Dion. And I've really had the privilege over the last 10 years to work closely with Malcolm, who's also known as the grandfather or the godfather of white-winged flufftails, as well as Warwick, and that's really been a huge privilege for me personally. So thank you, Malcolm and Warwick. I know you're both tuned in tonight into this webinar. And I'd also like to just recognize and say thank you to the Ethiopian Wildlife Natural History Society. That's the BirdLife partner in Ethiopia. And from the start, the EWNHS, this BirdLife partner in Ethiopia, provided support to Middelpunt Wetland Trust for the work that was undertaken in Ethiopia. So back here in South Africa, still now in the late 90s, the focus of the Middelpunt Wetland Trust was really on Middelpunt, then on another site, Bakkerstroom, and also on Franklin Bay. And around 1998, Barry Taylor also discovered white-winged flufftails in this area, which is exactly the same area where Eskom has proposed the pump storage scheme, the Ngula pump storage scheme. So of course, at that state, this is on the border of KwaZulu-Natal and the Free State on the escarpment. At that stage, there was huge outcry from Middlepunt Wetland Trust, and then later on from BirdLife South Africa, that this pump storage scheme shouldn't go ahead. But it became a massive conservation story, and the first discussions took place in 2001. The Ngula Partnership was formalized in 2004, and today we've got 8,000 hectares of pristine grassland and wetland habitat that's conserved in a nature reserve, so formally protected, and it's home to more than 20 plus threatened bird species. So I'd just like to highlight some of the people involved there. Again, on the scientific side, David Allen and Barry Taylor. Then thank you to the ESCOM, and we're still working with Deirdre Herbst, Tony Stott and Peter Nelson for the establishment of the partnership. Malcolm was very involved with the discussions from Middlepunt Wetland Trust, and then Alder Baruti for the discussions with BirdLife from BirdLife South Africa's side. So shortly after this project was initiated and this partnership was formalized, David Maprisa was appointed as our Ngula project manager, and David was just as involved in White-winged Flufftail conservation going forward. Then a couple of years later, in 2011, we were approached by Middlepunt Wetland Trust, so BirdLife South Africa was approached by the trust, and we took over the administration of the Middlepunt Wetland Trust, but the trust still is an entity on its own. So there was a change in trustees. You'll see that Adam Riley was added as a trustee, and then Roger Wanders, Mark, and myself also joined the other trustees. So the White-winged Flufftail in 2013, so 2 years later, was uplisted to critically endangered by the IUCN. And this was through BirdLife International. So this means just one step from extinction in the wild. And this was also based on the estimate that there's fewer than 250 birds remaining in the wild. So really, we realized the time is running out for the White-winged Flufftail, and that conservation action is urgently required. The main threats to the species are the destruction and the degradation of the species' habitat. That's really loss of habitat and change in habitat that's driving the species towards extinction. In South Africa, those main threats are upstream pollution, so pollution of our wetland systems. And we're particularly concerned about the wetland that's on the border of Middlepunt Wetland, about the mining development, a proposed mining development that's on the border of Middlepunt Wetland near Dahlstrom. Other threats also include overgrazing as well as excessive burning, and then any fluctuation in water levels. The birds are really sensitive to different water heights, so anything impacting on water supply. In Ethiopia, the main threat is overgrazing. So from this photograph here, you'll see that's actually a wetland habitat in Ethiopia. It's completely overgrazed by cattle, horses, also sheep. And that is the main threat. The secondary threat is also sedge cutting, so cutting of the sedges in the wetland habitat for fodder, and to a lesser extent also for coffee ceremonies. But for a small species, there's a big plan, and as early as in 1997, the white-winged flufftail was listed on Appendix 1 and Appendix 2 of the Convention of Migratory Species. A little bit later, in 2002, this bird was listed by the African Eurasian Migratory Waterbird Agreement. And thanks, Sergey. I think Sergey is also tuned in tonight. Sergey Derelev has really driven the conservation and the interest from AWA's side in terms of the conservation of white-winged flufftail. So the bird is currently receiving the highest level of protection from AWA. In 2008, the International Single Species Action Plan was published for the species. There's an international working group meeting that's held every 4 years. And the last one took place last year in 2019 in South Africa. And I was really, really pleased to see that on the implementation plan of all these actions, that we've made so much progress over the last 4 years in terms of our understanding of the species, and that can lead to direct conservation action on the ground. So back in Ethiopia, and we know that conservation is not exclusive of people, but rather inclusive, our biggest priority is to protect the habitat for the species. And Middlepunt Wetland Trust realized that years ago with the BirdLife partner in Ethiopia, and through the support of Rockjumper birding tours, and Adam is going to say a few words later, as well as the Ngula Partnership. A school was built for the community that's adjacent to Burger Wetland. And this school that's shown here, 1,200 pupils go to the school. They have a morning session and they have an afternoon session. And it's also called the Flufftail School. And there's also a site support group specifically for the white-winged flufftail. The role of the site support group is during the breeding season, which is relatively short. So during June to August, this site support group is responsible to stop the grazing in the wetlands, so to stop the cattle, horse and sheep from going into Burger Wetland. So there's different benefits for the community as well as for the white-winged flufftail, but this has never been formalized. So one of our very big discussion points at the moment and actions is to formalize the Burger community project, specifically for the Upper Burger floodplain. And we should have a concept that would be completed by the end of the year, and we should have a workshop early next year, after which we'll seek seed funding to continue with this project, looking at agricultural benefits for the community and, of course, big wins for the white-winged flufftail into the future. So back here in South Africa, after BirdLife South Africa started, we knew that as BirdLife South Africa, we really wanted to drive the conservation of the species in South Africa. And one of the first things that we started to do was to revisit all those sites where white-winged flufftail was once recorded. And here on this photograph, you'll see that it's still a traditional way of flushing. So that is what we used, and Robin will tell you all about the new technology. But a traditional way of flushing and trying to flush a white-winged flufftail out of the wetland habitat. And this particular work was undertaken by also a very well-known ornithologist, Greg Davies, who was then at the Bison Museum in Pretoria. So apart from all the research to understand more of the species, it's being that the bird's habitat is so threatened, we knew that what we need to do alongside the research is to protect the species habitat. So what I've indicated with the red and the green here are some protected environments as well as nature reserves that's formally protected. And most of BirdLife South Africa's stewardship work also covers this high altitude grassland sites specifically. And we've been fortunate now, so stewardship work is working with landowners to formally protect their land with lots of conservation benefits. And we've been very fortunate that we're able to make a full-time appointment for the White-winged Flufftail Project Manager, also called the Rockjumper Fellow of White-winged Flufftail Conservation. And that's Kyle Lloyd, and you'll be hearing more from Kyle later tonight. But Kyle's going to be based in this Dahlstrom area, and he's going to be working with the landowners in that area, but he'll also continue to drive all the other research and scientific aspects of the project. So at this stage, I'm just going to ask Adam to tell us, what does it mean to him personally? What is white-winged flufftail conservation, and why white-winged flufftails? Thanks, Adam.
Hi, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Hanneline, for that great introduction. Yeah, I was introduced to white-winged flufftails nearly 30 years ago by Dion Kutsia. And it was at the real infancy of the Middlepunt Wetland Trust, and he explained to me this is a bird that's on the brink of extinction, and essentially, if nothing's done about it, it's a species that's going to slip away. So little was known about it at that stage, just that it bred in Ethiopia. A few arrived in South Africa at a couple of isolated sites, and it really needed help. So since then, I've been involved in any way that I can to help the species. More recently, I was invited onto the board of the Middlepunt Wetland Trust. But as Hanneline mentioned, we'd already helped fund the school in Burger and various other projects that to the assistance of the flufftail. Yeah, it's just been wonderful to be able to be involved in the conservation of this species, and especially with the amazing new developments that Robin and Kyle will no doubt tell you about in the latter part of the webinar. We've really made some amazing progress, been fantastic. And part of my portfolio in the Middlepunt Wetland Trust has also been fundraising. And The Wetland Trust was actually first, the seed capital for that came out of a cruise that Dion Coetzee and Malcolm Drummond arranged back in the 90s, the first sort of birding cruise of South Africa. And I came up with sort of a similar idea that we did last year, which was the Kruger Birding and Wildlife Challenge. And we ended up with 8 teams of 10 people. And we basically covered from the bottom of the Kruger to the top of Kruger, trying to see as many bird and mammal species as possible. We actually gave a scoring system to each species. Common birds and mammals 1 point, uncommon ones 2, rare ones 3, and megas were 4. And we had these 8 teams go right through Kruger in a week or 8 days on this friendly competition, sharing information. And as a result of that, we actually managed to raise 400,000 Rand, which was just an amazing amount of money, and is making a huge impact in this flufftail conservation. In the process, we saw, my team saw 329 species. In total, I think about 389 species were seen of birds and about 70 mammal species. So we had incredible birds. One of the highlights was finding a golden pipit right at the end of the competition, and every single team got to see it and participant. And we are actually going to do the Kruger Birding and Wildlife Challenge again in 2022. So I do encourage you to come along. It's a ton of fun, and just amazing to see the whole of Kruger from top to bottom in open land cruiser and just birding and looking at wildlife the whole way. And yeah, we just, on behalf of Rockjumper, we're thrilled to be able to support the conservation of the species and support Kyle's position. We're also the BirdLife Species Champion for White-winged Flufftail, and it's a great honor for us to be involved. And I must congratulate everyone on this panel who's going to speak to you and the people supporting them for the incredible work that they've done over the last few years. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the webinar.
Thanks, Adam. And at this point also, I just want to say thank you to Adam and his company for being the species champion for white-winged flufftail conservation. And I know that our colleagues from BirdLife International is also tuned in. So thank you, Jim, Karihuki, and Roger for all your support from BirdLife International side. So at this point, as I mentioned in Ethiopia, that conservation is inclusive. So it's really important for us, and it's one of the actions within the International Species Action Plan to raise more awareness and do more education work around the species. So BirdLife South Africa has really taken this on. In 2013, White-winged Flufftail was the bird of the year. And we also started a Flufftail Festival to raise awareness for the species. And this is done in collaboration with Waterwise, Brand Water, and also the Rare Finch Conservation Group, and Jehota supporting the Rare Finch Conservation Group and BirdLife South Africa, as well as a huge number of other partners over the years. So we were fortunate to have our 6th Flufftail Festival this year already. We have a puppet show that's incorporated as part of the Flufftail Festival, and the small orange-breasted wax ball. It's called the Waxy the Hero Show. The small wax ball becomes the hero that saves the white-winged flufftail. And through this work, we don't only raise awareness for white-winged flufftail, but we're also raising awareness for other water birds, and specifically for wetland and water conservation. So a great partnership there as well. So from there, I'd like now to move on more to the scientific side and the research that we've undertaken over the past 7 years. So I think a question that might pop up is, why haven't we fitted a tracking device to the white-winged flufftail? So these birds weigh about 30 grams, they're very small. They're mostly in the undergrowth in the wetland, which makes it complicated for solar panels and with attachments, etc. And our option 7 years ago was to fit a geolocator. So we could fit a geolocator, but that means we would have to recatch the bird to actually retrieve the data, which wasn't really feasible for a bird that it's 250 birds left in the wild, critically endangered, and we didn't want to stress and add any stress to these individuals, specifically around the weight limit with the tracking device. with my background in genetics, I then reached out to Professor Antoinette Kotze at the National Zoological Garden and her team, and they were very keen to come on board. And we decided that we're going to collect blood samples in Ethiopia and South Africa, and we're going to see if we can unravel this mystery and see what the connection is between the Ethiopian and South African birds. So our question was really, whether these two populations are one species with a disjunct distribution, so it's just one species throughout, whether it is a migrating population in Ethiopia and South Africa, or whether there's two genetically differentiated and geographically isolated populations or species. So, and actually, we might be dealing with two separate species here. So that was our question on the table, or our questions. And then, of course, the fun part, to collect the blood samples. So off we went to Ethiopia in 2013, the team of us. And what we did was we used a very big, oversized butterfly net to catch the birds in Ethiopia. And within 2 days, we managed to have 7 birds, quite damp, wet conditions during the breeding season there. And with me here is Dr. Brett Gardner. Brett's been a volunteer on this project for many years. And we decided that it's absolutely pertinent that we have the involvement of a veterinarian on the project to make sure, while we're dealing with a critically endangered species, that if there's anything, that we minimize the handling time and any stress to the birds. And then back here in South Africa, it was far more difficult to collect the blood samples. So we got one sample through Barry Taylor, which was a Pauline collision. Then another sample from a bird that flew into a mistnet at Bakkerstroom, and that was in Dirk van Stuyvenberg's mistnet. And then off we went to Middelpunt, and finally we got a third blood sample. And I'd just like to recognize the team there too that was involved, especially Selma Rotenbach, over all the years, for all his enthusiasm and energy and helping us to collect these blood samples. Selma also joined us on the trip to Ethiopia. And then Craig Natchez. Craig was the lucky ringer on the day. There were many ringers that assisted. The White-winged Flufftail flew into his net, and Craig, up to today, hasn't washed his shirt because this was just such a special occasion for Craig. So we had 3 samples from South Africa, and after 2 trips, we had 10 samples from Ethiopia. So what you see here, the genetic results, and this is a haplotype network indicating genetic relatedness between the red-chested flufftail and white-winged flufftail. So we use the red-chested flufftail as an outgroup. And then, so the red is for the red-chested flufftail. Then the blue and the green are for white-winged flufftail. Blue for white-winged flufftail in Ethiopia, and the green for white-winged flufftail in South Africa. So even though we're seeing 2 separate clades here, there were only 3 interspecific variations, confirming that the Ethiopian and the South African birds are actually no different. Not enough to have a population level difference, and in other words, definitely not 2 separate species. But we do recognize a constraint in only having 3 samples from South Africa, so that's going to be one of our main targets going forward, is also to collect more blood samples in South Africa. And having those blood samples in hand, we decided to look at the innate immune region of the white-winged flufftail, specifically toll-like receptor genes. And you can see from the results they indicated in those red blocks that the genetic diversity, so the genetic diversity in the immune region of the white-winged flufftail is far lower compared to that of the more widespread, commonly found red-chested flufftail. And that's typical of a species that's got low numbers, have already undergone a bottleneck. So we see that in bird species that's often on islands and severely threatened, or have recovered on islands that just don't recover that genetic diversity. This means that the white-winged flufftail is at risk of a stochastic event. So if there was a disease outbreak or anything similar, these birds are actually at risk of extinction. So that's the end of my part of the webinar, and I'm going to hand over to Robin Colyn now. And Robin really is our leader in this field. It's through Robin's involvement that we're able to have made so much progress going forward in terms of our discoveries. But I must say, it's really exciting, and we've basically rewritten the ornithological books through our findings in the last few years. And at this stage also, our last tribute, just a thank you also to Alistair Campbell, that's been involved in the designs and from the start, and also two BirdLife colleagues that's been integrally involved, Karina Kutze and Melissa House-Whitecross, are very capable hosts tonight as well. Thanks, Robin, and over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Hanneline, for that very generous introduction. I'm going to be chatting about the development of a research monitoring regime for the species. And before I jump into camera traps and acoustic microphones, while I sync over to the presentation, I'd like to just highlight the background once again of about five and a half years ago when I started the project. Up until that stage, the only reliable method of surveying the species was really using walked flushing. So as Hanneline showed in one of the pictures, a line of observers moving through a wetland with or without a rope and hoping to elicit a flush, whereby the species flies out of the vegetation of the bird and you get a positive ID and therefore a presence point. But there were a number of concerns with this survey type, and foremost among them were the concerns around the potential impact of this. Sorry, let me just get to my, it seems to have kicked me out quickly. The impact of the survey type on the vegetation. So the vegetation that they occupy is generally very sedge dominated and sensitive to trampling, and hence there was a lot of concern around what would the potential impact be of trampling and flattening this vegetation. Also the potential of trampling on birds, because they obviously they only take flight as a last resort, and therefore really we had to look at developing a better method. Two other concerns around that method were if anyone has flushed, there's no reliability in terms of whether or not you're going to get a flush. So the species might be present. When you're conducting flushes, you often hear red-chested flufftails calling or African rails calling, but you might not even get a flush of those species. So therefore, there's no reliability. If you don't get a flush of a white-wing, it doesn't mean it's not there. And then the third big limitation of the survey type as well was that with extensive survey, as Hanneline pointed out in that publication, we were yielding less than one sighting a year. And from driving conservation initiatives, that really wasn't able to equip us to take the project forward. So in 2014, when I joined BirdLife, or shortly after I joined BirdLife, I started playing around with looking into the potential of using other more non-invasive methods that don't require extensive walking through the wetland and ultimately have the least impact on the bird species. And foremost among these was camera traps. So I started playing around with pilots and testing around camera traps in wetlands. And in 2015, Alistair Campbell and myself initiated a pilot project at Ngula Nature Reserve. And I'd like to just take this opportunity to thank the Ngula Nature Reserve for their long-standing commitment to the conservation of white-winged flufftail. And this pilot study really was supported by them in the initiation foundation stages in 2014 on Ngula Nature Reserve. So during this pilot project, we really used a grid of cameras, and we tested a whole range of different ways of using cameras in what is arguably one of the most challenging environments to survey with electronic equipment. The water levels are highly dynamic and they fluctuate daily. It's extremely humid and really challenging environments. But by the end of the survey, we were really confident and positive that we were onto something. We had generated a number of sightings of the Rallid community as a whole, but more specifically, our focal target species that we're using as a test case were more common red-chested flufftail. Towards the end of our survey, we had refined our technique and we were yielding 17 independent sightings of the species within a given survey. And just to show you what it looks like, some of the footage we were getting in towards the end of the survey, some really good photographic images of the birds, but more importantly, understanding how they were using habitats and what this potential applicability of this technique could be for the critically endangered white-winged flufftail. As mentioned, with camera trap studies, you don't just study your focal species, but you generate a plethora of information of other animals using the same space. And in this case, the broader Rallid community that we recorded in that particular study, from African crake to African rail to spotted crake in the top, through to other species like your crane species, African marsh harrier, your grass owls, as well as your mammalian and reptilian gills that could potentially be predators or facilitators in this community. So it really was showing itself up to be a method that could host a lot of value going forward. In 2016-17, so the following season, Alistair and myself once again put our minds together, and we replicated the study in what is definitely the key wetland site for research around White-winged Flufftail, that being Middelpunt wetland. So we replicated the study with some minor refinements to see if we can improve the detection of smaller bodied rallids like flufftails. And this really was the first milestone in terms of where we actively used an alternate method for trying to understand white-winged flufftails and ultimately address some of those gaps, foundational gaps in the ecology of the species as well as its conservation requirements. In order to conserve it, we really need to understand what does it need out of its habitat. So we mapped out vegetation communities at Middelpunt and then started using grids of camera traps with this refined technique. And we really were hoping for the gold nugget out of this, which would be confirmations of white-winged presence. The first 2 weeks of the project started off with some fantastic, very positive results. Extensive footage of, once again, our more common St. Patrick resident registered flufftail, both male and females in the right, as well as the kind of more rare juvenile phases. So we were not just getting presence hits, but we were actually also understanding were species breeding, were they breeding successfully, and what were the demographics across the site that we were surveying. In addition to that, we were not just working with still images, photographs, but we had some cameras put on video, which allowed us to then also tap into some behaviour observations to understand how these birds are interacting with one another. In this case, a juvenile white-winged flufftail really making a poor attempt at its first flights and fumbling into the bushes. And this really just gave us, once again, a very positive feel in terms of what we were doing was able to capture the life of flufftails. But the true milestone of the project came around in December 2016, when we, for the first time ever, documented white-winged flufftails in a non-invasive way in their natural habitat. So basically, white-winged flufftails doing what they do in the absence of human observers. And this included foraging and walking, and also a lot of what was very interesting at the time, which was wing flapping and voluntarily showing the white secondaries with the wings folded in, as you can see in the top right. And this was really of significant interest to us, but definitely a milestone stage in the progress of and development of this monitoring method. So over the course of the season, we yielded 8 independent sightings and just short of 30 images of white-winged flufftail, and this really just gave us the boost that we needed. And we then took this method, once again, with camera trapping, you don't just record your focal species, but you record a wealth of information around how your focal species is interacting with the broader community, both in positive and potentially negative ways. So in this case, the broader Rallid community, as you can see, black crake through to spotted crake once again, and then the demographics across these species, from juvenile through to adults and sex ratios and so on. But not just the avian gill, but also the mammalian and, in this case, reptilian gills. So we're looking at potential predators and their occupancy rates in these wetlands, as well as potential facilitators, like in the top center pair, common reedbuck, could potentially be facilitating and positively influencing the species by creating very fine, small trails through the wetland that definitely some rallids use, like African rallid. But it's not just about collecting presence points and photographs. We ultimately want to drive the conservation of the species. And what the big bonus of camera trap data is that it produces a lot of metadata. You get time and date stamps, you have localities for various camera traps, and over the course of a season or multiple seasons, we were able to then start presenting pictures of when do birds arrive, when do they leave, what habitat preferences are they preferring, what are they chasing within the wetland? Ultimately, what does it mean for us in terms of conservation actions on the ground and promoting persistence of the species going forward? And these results have redefined many facets of the ecology of the species and really unlocked some fundamental mysteries that have surrounded the species and resulted in a number of scientific publications. So we're not just feeding this into conservation action, we were making sure that our conservation actions that we implement are scientifically sound and based on good science. But definitely the milestone of the project or the development of the survey and monitoring regime was in 2017-18, where we took what we learned in the previous season and really redefined and kind of put in a whole bunch of new novel and almost out there ideas in terms of how to completely change how we put the cameras out and place them in this very dynamic habitat. So we went out and used a whole range of robust grids with triangulated microphones or acoustic recorders to try and gather some more information around white-winged flufftails. And hopefully, the hope was to try and identify and isolate the call. But this method as a whole completely astounded us in terms of how it performed. It really was phenomenal in terms of the results we yielded. We yielded an over 10 times better detection probability, i.e. our ability to detect the species and number of sightings we were generating was significantly greater and really was encouraging. And this, I'm going to show you some clips, and just the footage itself, I think, speaks for itself in terms of just how significantly better the method was performing. In this case, you'll see images of females, so slightly less richly colored around the neck and the throat, but their chestnut tail and white spotting on the back, distinctive features with a bit of that white coloration in the belly, as well as extensive footage of males. As you can see, more rich chestnut coloration, as well as a bit of a more streaked appearance in the back. But importantly, a lot of the same behavior that we found in the previous season, of wing flapping, birds standing with their wings open, showing off those white secondaries. Also in the bottom center and right, birds displaying those white secondaries even when the wings are folded in. And really this came across very strongly to myself and the team as being territorial behavior. And it really raised some key questions around why is a non-breeding bird spending so much time exhibiting territorial behavior. And what definitely was the first, the greatest milestone of this season, which I'm going to show you now in a second. And once again, just video clips, which together with stills, just allowed us to piece that much more around the behavior of the species and really unlocked a bit of interesting facets in terms of how these species interact with their habitats and other species, other rails like black crack and African rail, for instance. But the milestone came just before Christmas in 2018. It was definitely a huge and the biggest Christmas present we could have hoped for, and that was trawling through over 100,000 images in our database that we had acquired over that period of the season. We came across multiple records of breeding events by the species, and really this redefined what we know about white-winged flufftails in its entirety. And essentially we've rewritten the field guides about the species. There's not just one breeding population in the north, but in fact there are two breeding populations, one in the south and one in the north. And along with this and the method that we used, we were able to, with the triangulated acoustic devices, we were able to isolate the call and really solve a mystery that has eluded scientists since the description of the species in the late 1800s. Myself and Alistair were able to identify two primary calls. In the top left, a contact call or alarm call, and in the top bottom left is the call that they use extensively for territorial displays and so on. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank all of our donors that have made this work possible, the Ngula Partnership for their long-standing support to white-winged flufftail conservation, the Department of Environmental Affairs, Airports Company South Africa, the Ford Wildlife Foundation, and importantly, ChemJV from my side, who supported the ChemJV Fellow Bird Conservation, my post for the past 3 years, and allowed me to have the privilege of being out there and really trying to study the species and conserve it. Leading on from there, you might ask, well, why have we not heard of the call yet? Why has it not been released? And really what I'd like to drive home here is that white-winged flufftails are a critically endangered species, and they face a very real and significant risk of extinction. Hanneline has shown you some of the genetics related to that, and just from population numbers, the picture is dire. The species is highly sensitive to any form of disturbance, both human presence within the wetland as well as on the edges. So even doing callbacks on the edges of the wetlands has got an impact on the species. We have documented this both in Ethiopia and in South Africa. The edges are important habitat for the species once the wetland fills up. The species is highly specialized in that they favor shallower sedge meadows. They then move to the edges and they need intact edges that haven't been trampled. And even just with human presence in the wetland, we've noted it has a significant impact on their behavior whilst breeding. And as Hanneline also alluded to, they have a very small and short breeding cycle. So it's imperative that they have the time they need to do what they need to do. And this is significant for the promotion and of the persistence of the species going forward. And then lastly, we also have these results currently in press, in publication with the Journal of Avian Conservation and Ecology. This is both the breeding record as well as the vocalizations. Once this is published, this will be an open access article that describes the call, provides sonograms, etc. And like I said, this will be open access to all. And we are working extensively on trying to find methods in which we could enjoy this bird species without causing any detrimental impacts on it. So we are working on trying to find ways in which we can bird and enjoy the species in its wild natural habitat. The pics on the bottom right kind of just bring it home. On the left is the nest and just shows you how secretive and elusive the species can be. And what you can see there when it's zoomed in is this is a female on a full clutch of 5 eggs that refused to leave the nest, even when we were very close by. This is doing a breeding assessment survey that we were doing, and it just shows how vulnerable these birds can be. That if it refuses to leave off the nest and a observer is walking through the wetland, there's a very real risk of trampling not just the nest, but potentially the adult as well. And just kind of drives home how sensitive the species can be during these periods of breeding. We are not just driving novel and really exciting research on the ground in terms of monitoring initiatives, but I've also been implementing a number of modeling initiatives that use kind of forefront technologies, including satellite imagery, etc., to try and identify and understand where could the species be distributed across its global range, but as well as on a local level. As Hanneline mentioned, the corridor between Ethiopia and South Africa is not well understood, but our modeling results are really encouraging and showing 2 core populations, which we know to be true in Ethiopia and in the highlands of South Africa, and then disjunct populations across Africa. So Kenya, northern Tanzania, southern Tanzania, Malawi, Zimbabwe, and then 1 or 2 isolated pockets in Rwanda and Burundi. So very exciting that we now have a tool that can drive surveys going forward and ultimately allow us to focus in the areas that offer the greatest chance of finding the species and making sure we get those sites secured. To show you what a local, more fine-scale model looks like, this is for South Africa. And this is really a fine-scale model driven with the objective of identifying local level wetlands that have the highest probability of hosting the species based on where the wetlands located in terms of topography and environmental variables, but also down to the level of what's the vegetation structure looking like in the wetland. These birds are highly specialized, as mentioned, and this model is performing really well and is allowing us and Kyle going forward, as we'll be sharing with you, to go out, target these wetlands for surveys, and when presence is obtained, when we really know that the species is there, make sure that these sites are protected and conserved. This is ultimately the only hope the species faces going forward, is ensuring that what's left is actively conserved. To just kind of bring this whole situation to a close and just bring the plight home to show you what we've been doing and why we're doing what we're doing. We did exactly this in Ethiopia in 2018. We implemented a very targeted survey across the Sawulta and the Berg of floodplains, which we call breeding areas for the species in the Ethiopian highlands. And we conducted breeding surveys across a period of about a week, just over a week, and then used these modeling techniques to bolster the results and basically mapped out the breeding habitat left for the species under current conditions. And our results were sobering, but once again highlights the plight of the species, that under current conditions, about 90% of what was available to the species has been lost through various land use changes, but primarily agriculture, overgrazing. So only 10% of what was intact historically is left. And this leaves us in that particular core part of the range with a maximum population size of 55 pairs. The species definitely faces a very high risk of extinction and warrants the significant attention that it has been given over the years. And once again, we'd just like to thank the core sponsors that have made all of this work possible. And I am truly privileged to have been part of the project. And just a huge thanks to everyone that has made it possible. You are definitely contributing significantly to the persistence of this highly threatened species. So I'd like to hand over to Kyle now, who's going to be sharing a little bit about the conservation action that he is currently implementing and as well as got planned out going forward. Over to you, Kyle.
Yeah, welcome everyone, and thank you for sticking around to the end. I'll promise I'll be done within the next 10 minutes. At this point, I'd like to thank Adam Riley and Rockjumper Birding Tours, who through the Preventing Extinctions program at BirdLife International have been able to afford me this position and allow me to contribute to white-winged flufftail conservation. It's a huge privilege, so thank you very much. Yeah, before I introduce our objectives going forward, I would like to just talk about the philosophy or approach we are taking to how we structure these objectives. And this very much falls under the banner of adaptive management. So this is a self-learning or iterative process. So through observations and experimental design, we're able to have a better understanding of the species and the ecosystem processes that affect it. We then translate this into best practice guidelines, which the practitioner on the ground can carry out, and we also assist with the implementation. A key component to this whole cycle is to monitor and quantify the outcome or success of the project. If it is successful, we can upscale this and introduce it at other sites, or we can refine or go back to the drawing board if it's not successful. And as you have seen from Hanneline and Robin's presentations, a lot has already been done and is currently being translated into best practice guidelines. But there are still significant knowledge gaps that remain, and we want to address these so that they do not hinder conservation of the species. So to do this requires a very holistic view of the grassland ecosystem. And the two main drivers that we as humans have control over are fire and grazing regimes. These in turn affect wetlands and grasslands, which in turn affect invertebrate communities, which are a major food source for the avian community, which we are interested in. And so by researching these different tiers within the ecosystem, we can better inform the way in which we manage fire and grazing. So the white-winged flufftail is in many ways a flagship species. It's an ambassador of many different conservation initiatives. So by conserving the species and its habitat, we are also conserving water resources, and which are very important for the communities around it and the people downstream. We also conserve habitat that is used by other threatened and vulnerable species, which may not have the resources to effectively conserve them. Because the white-winged flufftail is also a habitat specialist, it's indicative of a healthy and functioning ecosystem, which any farmer that is interested in productivity would find valuable. The white-winged flufftail also provides a platform to raise issues of water and wetland conservation, which we do through the annual Flufftail Festival. But the bird not only has initiated these different conservation outcomes, but it has also brought all these different and diverse stakeholders to the same table that can collaborate on conservation. And one of the most important stakeholders to white-winged flufftail conservation is the Greater Larkenvlei Protected Environment. So for those that don't know about protected environments, this is essentially landowners that have come together and have agreed to prioritizing conservation on their property. And the Greater Larkenvlei Protected Environment falls over the core breeding sites of the white-winged flufftail. And already we have had landowners engage with us and express interest in working with us. And these landowners also have different land uses that they're carrying out on their property. So this provides a fantastic opportunity to compare different land uses, which can then feed back into the best practice guidelines. For the rest of the presentation, I'm just going to elaborate briefly on our research objectives. So these research objectives have been guided by the implementation plan that was recently discussed with the White-winged Flufftail International Working Group, and which we also believe are core to the species conservation. So these are population dynamics. So again, continuing that long-term monitoring of the population so that we know and stay up to date with what is happening in the field. We also want to provide the first ever vital rates for the species. We also want to figure out the distribution of the bird within South Africa and abroad. And this helps us to identify previously unidentified wetlands and give them the proper conservation status that they need. We're also interested in where the bird goes during winter and predictors of its arrival and departure from its breeding habitat. And again, this informs things like the timing of when to set fires or to graze nearby grasslands. We also want to understand the habitat requirements of the bird in terms of flora and fauna. Again, talking to that community level approach that I spoke about earlier. But we also don't want to do research just for the sake of research. We want this to ultimately feed back into habitat guidelines. So just for the sake of time, I'll talk briefly about the methodology of the population dynamics and distribution. So it's very important that we derive estimates of the population size in South Africa, and that we track these changes over time so that we can identify drivers of population trends. And with sufficient time, we can then even explore things like climate change and how that is going to affect the population. And I would also just like to say thank you to the Dalstroom Trout Farm, who have continued to allow us to monitor at Middelpunt Wetland. A new feature of the population study is to introduce mark recapture. So by being able to identify an individual, we are able to track its fate over time and then derive estimates like survival. So we'll be trapping the birds using walk-in traps and flap traps. We'll then be ringing the birds with color bands. We'll then be using the monitoring system that's already in place to capture the bird as our resites and identify the rings that are on the bird's legs. We then can develop this encounter history matrix over time. And with this, we can then derive estimates like survival, reproductive success, and recruitment, and develop population projection models. Once we have this, we can then compare different management scenarios and predict their outcomes. Over the last century and a half, we've had scattered sightings of the white-winged flufftail across South Africa, and many of these wetlands have most likely disappeared through agriculture, plantations, and mining. But we want to go back to these historical sites and actually confirm where the bird is still present. And many of these sites will stretch out along the escarpment, so stretching from Mpumalanga into the Free State, KwaZulu-Natal, and even northern parts of the Eastern Cape. And to do this, we'll be using the ecological niche modeling that Robin spoke about. So we know the broad habitat requirements of the bird. And once we put these layers over one another, we can then identify wetlands where the bird is likely to occur. We can then visit these identified sites with acoustic devices, which we can place in the wetlands, and then record the presence of the bird through its call. We're also excited to be collaborating and working with the Wildlife and Environmental Society of Malawi to carry out an expedition to Nico Plateau next summer, as well as collaborating again with Alistair Campbell, who will be joining us. That's it from me. I just wanted to say another big thank you to our collaborators and supporters who have assisted us in this big endeavor, and also to ask you to please help us. There are two main ways you can help us, through any sightings that you may have of the bird, either recently or in the past. Please contact me with the location and the date, as well as donations. So because of the bird's cryptic behavior, we have to use these passive monitoring devices to detect the bird's presence. And unfortunately, these are quite pricey. So any contribution can go a long way to helping with the project. The banking details will be available afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hanneline, Kyle, and Robin. I am absolutely amazed at what this team has been able to achieve, and it's really goosebump stuff just hearing that story retold. I know that particularly in the last couple of years, as Robin showed, there's so much that we've learned about the species. So a big thank you to the three of you for coming on to Conservation Conversations and sharing your experiences and amazing discoveries about this little bird. And I hope that everyone listening tonight has a new appreciation for just what an amazing creature this is and how much hard work is going into protecting them and their wetland habitats. So before we jump into the plethora of questions that are streaming into our Q&A box, I'd just like to remind everybody that you can type your comments into the Q&A box as well as the Facebook Live chat box. We'll be feeding those into the different speakers as we go. I'd also like to remind everybody that after the webinar, when you exit, you'll be directed to a quick survey. There are some questions that will help our White-winged Flufftail team going forward, so please do take the time to answer that survey. And just to remind everyone that we have a new Jacana Media monthly giveaway, so be sure to check out our Conservation Conversations website and sign up for that competition. Next week, Daniel Manowick's going to be presenting a talk on how the big year for biodiversity was rocked by the COVID-19 pandemic, but how the global conservation community is coming together to forge a new green future in the wake of the challenges brought about by this international crisis. So be sure to tune in and watch Daniel's webinar next week. And now we're going to tackle some of these questions. So the first question I'm going to launch is probably going to be best answered by Robin. So Robin, Sandy Lynn is asking about wetland vegetation is typically quite short at these sites where white-winged flufftails have been recorded, typically sort of knee or waist height. Would you expect to find them in the Phragmites tall sort of wetland structure? So maybe just explain the difference between Phragmites typha and sedges, if you don't mind, Robin. Thanks. Oh, you're on mute, Robin. Sorry, I'm just gonna. There we go. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Phragmites is definitely it's not a suitable habitat for white-winged flufftails. It's generally characterized by deeper water levels, which they don't like. They're preferring shorter, shallower water with but knee-height sedge-dominant vegetation communities. They do also use typha. We have a couple of records from typha, or particularly typha vegetation with mixed sedge and herbaceous components in it. So essentially anything that has shallower water with good basal and canopy structure to allow them to feel a bit secure and not out in the open. That's kind of what they're going after. There definitely is a trophic level interaction, a food component that we yet to unlock, and Kyle's going to be investigating that going forward, because even in these Phragmites sections, when it dries out a bit, we never get them in those sections. So I don't know if that answers your questions, but sedge dominant or sedge typha mix is definitely the preferred types of habitat.
Thanks, Robin. Then this next one will probably be Kyle's responsibility going forward, but Robin, historically yours. So Dale Steele is asking whether there are species lists of the camera trap detections that have been found. So looking more at the broader community of our species that we've detected. So maybe Robin can talk historically, and then Kyle can talk about how that could potentially be shared with people going forward.
Right, so I mean, historically we've got 3 seasons in of active large-scale surveys, and 2 of those are already published with the species list as appendices, the full species list of everything we recorded, either on the cameras and or on the acoustics. So that's definitely is available. Yeah, if you'd like, you can contact me by email, and I'll be happy to share those with you. Going forward, Kyle, I don't know if you want to elaborate on the process going forward.
Yeah, that's definitely the beauty of camera traps, is that it records everything that comes across its path. Yeah, we'll definitely be making those lists available. There's different platforms like our website. There's a White-winged Flufftail page. We can make that available there. But I'm also thinking of developing a newsletter, making that available. So if anyone is interested on signing up to that, just contact me, and I'll add you to the mailing list.
Thanks, Kyle and Robin. So this next one is from Louise Brown, and perhaps Hanneline, you can speak to this. Louise is asking, do you have any interaction with the Working for Wetlands program?
So Louise, at the moment our interaction is minimal, but it's part of Kyle's position going forward as well, and it's also part of some of the other stewardship projects that we're looking and what we're busy are implementing on the ground, specifically to look at habitat restoration work. So we're doing more of that currently in the Western Cape, but we're bringing that aspect into our flufftail conservation work as well. And yeah, we look forward to hopefully in a year or 2 when we report that we'll be able to positively report on our engagement with the Working for programs.
Thanks, Hanneline. So we've had a number of questions talking towards an updated population estimate. So Robin, I know you briefly touched on this with your Ethiopian study, and would you just like to elaborate a little bit more on how close or far we are from having an updated population assessment? And I'll get Kyle to come in afterwards just to explain why it's difficult to nail down these population estimates. Kyle's our population ecologist specialist. So Robin, over to you.
So Kyle will definitely elaborate on the big plans going forward, but up until this point, given the difficulty in just getting sightings and really the need was developing a method of actually studying the species, we've been using the density of pairs within areas and available habitat as proxies for trying to understand how many potential birds there are and what it means for population estimates. As mentioned in my last slide of my section, the population for Ethiopia, or at least for the core sites that we know of and that the model's bringing up, that being the Sawulta Plain and the Burger Plains, we've got an estimate of 55 pairs, which if we compare that to the 1990s estimates provided, those estimates were in and around 200 to 250 pairs. So it's definitely a massive warning sign that the species is in trouble. We've lost up to 90% of the habitat in the north, while across the range, wetlands are one of the most threatened habitat types out there. In South Africa, that's yet to be determined, but we have some preliminary results out based on the past 3 seasons, and we're not looking at much more than the regional estimate for South Africa, which is in the range of about 50 to 70 pairs. So definitely a species that warrants the status of critically endangered. And then Kyle, I mean, you've got some really exciting plans going forward around population modeling.
Yeah, so I think the individual marking is going to be quite key. So being able to distinguish between or among individuals will really allow us to make those robust estimates. And yeah, as Robin said, the method has been refined, which has allowed for much higher detection rates. So that's going to also allow for good estimates. Yeah.
Thanks, guys. And our good friend Kish Chetty from Eskom has put a question to us. And Kish has been a long-standing member of the Ngula Partnership, which has been a massive supporter of this flufftail work. So thank you to Eskom and the Ngula Partnership, as well as Middlepunt Wetland Trust, that are part of that partnership with BirdLife South Africa. So Kish is asking, what scientific research is being conducted in Ethiopia, and has it resulted in NGOs and universities from Ethiopia undertaking more collaborative global efforts to save the species, or is it largely South Africa driving this process? Now, Hanneline, you're quite involved through the AWA partnership in working in Ethiopia. Would you like to just elaborate a little bit more on what is currently being done in Ethiopia, and then possibly Robin can touch on some of the kind of collaborative research that's also being carried out there?
Absolutely, thanks. Thanks, Kish, for that question. I will touch on the scientific side. I'm just going to first touch more on the conservation side. So we have a BirdLife partner in Ethiopia, Ethiopian Wildlife Natural History Society. So they've been involved over the years with support to the site support group specifically. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, that involvement with the community at Burger, we'd like to formalize that specifically from an agricultural perspective, so that the agricultural undertakings in that area, whatever land use is brought into the area, that is sustainable going forward. There's also a dairy farm, and the dairy farm has been very influential actually in the conservation of the species and been very supportive. So a lot is happening at the moment. We've got a study that's led, and there will be a full proposal on how to take this work forward. COVID related, it's been a little bit delayed, but hopefully by the end of the year we will have a proposal, and then early next year we'll be able to have a workshop to formalize that also from a government perspective. So it's not only the NGOs, but also the Ethiopian Department of Environment, UCA, so Ethiopian Wildlife and Conservation Authority, that's involved in the conservation of the species. And then very recently, over the past 2 years or so, Dr. Buktawit Abdu has been involved as a postdoctoral researcher, specifically at Burger Wetland. Unfortunately, Brooke's postdoc has come to an end now, but we're hoping with the position at a university that she'll be able to drive some conservation. and that we'll be able to do more collaborative research going forward. And Robin might want to add to that.
No, I think you summed it up very well, Hanneline. Yeah, Brooke really she undertook a massive large-scale survey in the Burger floodplain, and ultimately was looking to answer one of those big questions, and that is, how many birds do we have, and what's driving occupancy, the factors influencing whether or not to occupy sites across that particular given region. So a really fascinating study, and that's definitely going to be providing some very insightful results and potentially some interesting conservation actions going forward. But like Hanneline mentioned, that project's just been finalized, and as far as I'm aware, those results will obviously be published in the short term. But going forward, yeah, that's what's in the cards.
Yeah, I think if I could just add on there again, another question as well about research, but the habitat conservation of Burger wetland is absolutely critical. So if we're going to lose Burger wetland, that's the last remaining stronghold for white-winged flufftails in Ethiopia. That the future for the species in Ethiopia would really be dire. And with us still not understanding the connection with our South African birds, it's even more pertinent that we absolutely protect that breeding site. Yeah, so we're looking at trying to search big funding to be able to make sure that we can sort of have a solid community project with benefits for the community and the white-winged flufftail going forward.
And like Kyle mentioned as on his presentation, linked to what Hanneline was mentioning now, we are looking at establishing collaborations in Central Africa to try and hopefully find another population that might be occurring in the middle, just to help, yeah, I guess, find habitats that are hosting the species and ultimately conserve the species. Finding anything in between would be critical in terms of working towards keeping the species around.
Absolutely, thanks all. And I can attest to that. One of our colleagues, Alistair McInnes, will be coming onto the webinar on the 21st. Alistair was part of the survey team that went out in 2006 and did the survey across the Salota Plain site in Ethiopia. And to give you an idea of just how quickly these sites can change, when Robin and I were there in 2018, what was a wetland is now very much a dry grassland that's been completely drained and no longer hosts any flufftails. So that's in the span of a decade that we've lost one of the key sites that used to host at least 22 known pairs. That's now disappeared due to management changes. So it's critical that we get onto the ground and really do our utmost to make sure that correct management practices are in place to make sure that we support these birds. So our next question is probably going to be best suited with Robin. This is from Marco, and he's asking, did you do any active predator deterrent when you were putting out your camera traps to try and avoid any impacts on the flufftails?
Yeah, so one of, if you just doing literature searches, one of the key elements around wetland surveys in general, no matter which species you're doing it, but particularly there's some documented cases for harriers, hen harriers and such in the north, where braided trails can lead to increased predation rates on the ground. So we were very cognizant of this. We only ever walked with one observer in while putting cameras up, so we don't create compacted trails. And we really took a lot of precautions around that in order to not create these trails that both carry scent and obviously easier access in terms of trampling. So that was foremost in our thinking, and we did all we could around that. In terms of other measures of actively deterring predators in these core wetland sites, we did not go down that route. We were literally just looking at developing a survey method. And ultimately, as all these things are quite complex, so if you implement one thing to deter a predator, it might have a knock-on for another component of the broader community. But from what we picked up on our camera traps, were naturally functioning, trophic gills with predators coming through occasionally. And interestingly enough, when the predators would come through, we'd have much lower hits on those clusters of cameras, particularly otter or serval. Would generally operate on a route quite extensively over a period of a week, and then you'd see slight shifts in where territories were located and such. So these birds are very keyed into the environment and obviously are naturally evolved with predators in their system, and they were responding to that. So and what we did also do is we increased our visit rates. So we increased the duration between visits to the maximum. So we would not go check on cameras every week or 2 weeks or even every month. We had a very long interval between checking on cameras. And we essentially allow the birds to set up a territory, breed, and finish breeding before we come back to check hamlets. We put in a whole bunch of methods and kind of checkpoints to make sure that our impact was as minimal as could possibly be maintained.
Thanks, Robin. So, Hanneline, I think you'll probably be best to answer this next one. This is from George Ledeck, and he's asking whether there will be any future organized trips in either South Africa or Ethiopia to try and see white-winged flufftails in the wild. And is it actually possible to do this at this point?
Yeah, so I was hoping I was not going to get that question. Yeah, George, is a tricky one. As we know, a couple of years ago, we did the public viewings at Middelpunt, and that was before that, realizing that we have another breeding population in Southern Africa, and the funding that was raised through those public viewings went directly to protecting the breeding habitat in Ethiopia. But where we are now, with just knowing how sensitive the species, how short the breeding season is, numbers, the status, we're just not at the point that we can allow public viewings and doing any flushes through the wetlands as such. But part of Kyle's role is also to explore ways that we can show the public white-winged flufftails. I know it's a massive tick on everybody's birding list, and we really do want to share the bird with the public. So we want to look at ways that we could do it. In the short-term future, not sure how we're going to do it, but we're exploring ways. And one of our post-webinar questions is actually, if you've got any brilliant ideas for us on this matter, please let us know, because it's something we feel just as passionate about. So thank you.
Thanks, Hanneline. Very diplomatically answered. Great. So I think, Kyle, you'll probably be best to answer this, as you'll be dealing with this going forward. Stephen is asking, in terms of rehabilitation of wetlands, we know that these birds occur in sedge and grass-dominated wetlands, but obviously these have very complicated vegetation structures and quite sensitive hydrological regimes. So Stephen's interested to know if we have any white-winged flufftail sightings in particularly degraded wetlands, and whether there's going to be any movement going forward as to rehabilitating some of those sites.
Yeah, so one thing about the species is that we still know so little about it. But what we have seen is like Middelpunt wetland, where there is grazing. There is definitely site comparisons to versus a nature reserve where the area is pristine and the bird also occurs. So it does seem to have some tolerance, but we know that it is a habitat specialist, that it requires these intact, continuous patches of sedge-dominated wetlands, and so we are trying to work towards rehabilitating these wetlands. We want to engage with working for wetlands with Mpumalanga Tourism and Parks Agency, where we have those specialists, and with that knowledge, want to go forward. There are rehabilitation activities being planned, and we are going to be involved in those projects. So yeah, we'll be monitoring the species response, seeing how improving the habitat quality has affected the bird. And again, that just feeds into informing us in how we take this forward.
Thanks, Kyle. And we've got a question from Mike Bridgeford, and he's asking whether there's any evidence that these birds are actually migrating or not. So I think, Robin, some of the work that you've been doing, there's some contending theories. Maybe you want to run us through some of those.
Around whether or not the birds, so originally, I mean, up until recently, it was believed, and all the literature stated that the bird breeds in Ethiopia and then migrates down in austral summer into its non-breeding range, which is primarily South Africa. Combining our modeling work, both on the continental scale as well as a local scale, and this is looking at habitat suitability as well as with some rainfall modeling, because they obviously, these birds respond quite acutely to rainfall events. So they arrive in South Africa and in Ethiopia in terms of occupying these highlands. They're occupying these highlands very shortly after big rainfall events, and they're there for about a month or two, and then they dissipate out of that particular site. So when we tie up the rainfall modeling across a whole year for that whole range from South Africa through to Ethiopia, and combine it with what we find in terms of when they're breeding. So they're breeding in South Africa anywhere from October through to January, February, and they're breeding in Ethiopia anywhere from, like Hanneline mentioned, from June, July, August. But there are presence records all the way up into September. And if you piece all of that together, it's just not really possible for a bird, I think from an energetics point of view, to breed in July, August, and then migrate down and breed literally a month and a half later in South Africa. So we're definitely dealing with, at least in some context, two separate or two breeding populations, not separate in terms of that are mixed, but separate in terms of spatial locality. And when you add the rainfall to that and you simulate this across the continents, it suggests that if birds were moving across countries, that our birds in South Africa wouldn't need to move further than southern Tanzania before they can return and hit the wet season in South Africa again. And the Ethiopian population wouldn't need to move much further than northern Tanzania, southern Tanzania, and hit the bimodal rainfall patterns in that area before they could move back up north. So what the results are showing is that in terms of their specialized niche of hopping between wetland sites and going for these shallowly flooded areas, and obviously having some of the mid-altitudes available that are wetter for longer, a full migration from South Africa to Ethiopia seems like it wouldn't be needed at all. That doesn't mean it doesn't occur. I mean, obviously the golden carrot would be waiting for a tracker that's small enough to put on birds. But given all of our research and the modeling and our increased understanding of the ecology of the bird, it would seem that we definitely have multiple populations that mix in good years. And just my 2 cents or my kind of gut feel suggests that we possibly have a southern, northern, and then hopefully a central kind of population that then meet on the edges in good rainfall years across those particular areas. That is my hope, and it's also a glimmer of hope for the species. And if we can get that central population identified, it might just add to our current population estimates and to the prospects for the species going forward.
Thanks, Robin. We've got a question from Eleanor Mary, and she's asking whether there's any evidence that predators have actually taken eggs from a nest or even an adult bird. And I think this is a tricky one because I don't think we've ever actually found a nest of a white-winged flufftail in South Africa. We've just got your chick sightings on the cameras, Robin. I know we had some exposure in Ethiopia, which Robin, Hanneline, and I and Caroline House Whitecross have just published a short com, which will be coming out in Ostrich shortly, where we observed eggs being removed from white-winged flufftail nest in Ethiopia, likely by a snake, but we were unfortunately not there to record the predator removing those. There is some evidence of similar species like the streaky-breasted flufftail, where there's camera footage of snakes taking them on at their nest sites. But hopefully in Kyle's future, he'll be able to locate a nest for us and monitor whether there is any predator removal. I don't know if any of the panelists would like to add to that with any of their sort of anecdotal observations.
I think, I mean, in terms of just understanding the ecology of the species, it's a ground nesting species, which definitely faces quite a high risk of predation, and hence a slightly larger clutch size of generally 4 to 5 eggs. And in the 2 seasons that we recorded breeding events, we had 3 full cycles. We were able to record from actually establishing the territory to breeding, to fledging the chicks, and then to actually having the chick become independent. I say chick in this case because we started off with 4 chicks, and in all 3 of those events, we ended up with 1 to 2 chicks. So I think that's definitely suggestive that there definitely is naturally, as one would expect, a predatory effect, and the survival kind of estimate just for those 3 clutches was 1 to 2 chicks out of every clutch. So definitely is an interplay, whether it's snakes or mammals. I'm sure, I mean, we picked up a lot of mongoose and serval movement throughout the wetlands. I think it definitely would be a factor, as one would expect in these natural systems.
Thanks, Robin. We've got a question from Alan Ridley asking how we recognize the audio recordings from the surveys that have been done. Are you using machine learning? And maybe you can just explain a little bit about how quiet that call actually is and difficult it is to pick up in the cacophony of wetland choruses that we typically record the sounds in.
Right. Yeah, so that was, I mean, that was the big milestone and the mystery that definitely it took a while to crack. So what we used was a triangulated system where our microphones are triangulated with coupled camera traps. So we could see what's moving around, we could hear what's calling, and we could then use multiple arrays of triangulated microphones to start picking up and identifying who's making what sound. Many of the species, it's quite easy. They're well documented, all the other the craics and rails that occur in these systems. So once we'd identified the call, there were a couple of very obvious factors as to why it has gone undetected for as long as it has. And the first is just the audibility of the call. It's a very soft call in terms of, both in terms of decibels and hertz on the sonogram. It's sitting very low on the hertz spectrum, and in terms of audibility, it's a very soft call. It doesn't travel like one would expect with a striped flufftail or a buff-spotted flufftail, or even a red-chested for that matter. Territorial calls travel quite far, and you can pick that call up as an observer quite far away from the wetland edge. It's not the case with white-winged flufftails. And in fact, what we've noted is when they're busy conducting the extensive territorial vocalizations, if there's a peak in other ambient noise, so i.e. an African rail starts vocalizing, we actually see them drop off and stop vocalizing. And as soon as the rail stops calling, it then recommences its call, which is really interesting. And I've actually heard this in the field. I was fortunate enough this past season to actually interact a bit with, or at least from the wetland side, to listen to how this bird vocalizes. And it does not travel much more than we estimate from our surveys, Melissa, when we went to Ethiopia, as well as in South Africa, not much more than 60 to 70 meters, which is really, at least to a human ear, not so necessarily to a microphone, where you can amplify it and really dig a bit deeper. And it gets drowned out pretty easily by ambient noise. And it's not on the spectrum that one would expect for a flufftail, like a hoot. It's not your common red-chested or striped hooting call. And if you add all three of these together with just a low density and a very short breeding cycle, and as far as we can tell, they only call while they're establishing the territory. Once the female's on eggs, they're still vocalizing a bit, and towards the end of the incubation, they kind of stop vocalizing, particularly once the eggs are hatched. So you have a very small window to catch it, and the sound does not travel, so you have to be in the right place at the right time. If you add all of that together, hence it's been a real challenge kind of cracking this mystery.
Thanks, Robin.
In terms of machine learning, sorry, I didn't answer that one. Because we didn't have a base signature for machine learning, generally you need some sort of trained base signature to pull out these calls out of a database. We didn't know what we were looking for. We were looking for a hoot or a boom or a oop, or, we actually manually went through it using the camera trap footage with the triangulated microphones. So that was our kind of, call it secret to cracking this. And once we'd actually isolated the calls, yes, we have been looking at using automated identification or classification of the calls using like a machine learning type approach. But that's even in itself proving very challenging, because the call gets drowned out really easily with background noise, particularly other bird calls, and it occurs on very low spectrum, so it's very low on the hertz spectrum. With the ambient noise in these wetland systems, it gets drowned out a lot, and now we are finding that it's a little bit more tricky to get higher accuracies in terms of the machine learning algorithm pulling those calls out. But we're working at that, and hopefully we'll make some progress going forward.
Thanks so much, Robin. I am aware that we've hit the 8:30 mark, which is typically where we sign off, but maybe just as a last question, Aldo Baruti, who has long roots with BirdLife South Africa, has asked whether we'll be going down to Inskeni Flay to be doing any audio monitoring. So Kyle Lloyd, would you mind just confirming whether we will be visiting Inskeni Flay in future, please?
Yes, Inskeni is a big one that we'll definitely be visiting. We're already in talks with EKZN Wildlife. So yeah, we'll probably be there this summer. And we'll accompany those. We'll use acoustic devices as opposed to the camera traps that we used last time. And yeah, we're hoping for better conditions as well for the bird to be present. And yeah, we'll probably accompany that with playbacks to really try and elicit a call from the bird and confirm if it's there. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Carl. I'd just like to thank all of our panelists this evening. That's been a really fun session and some amazing, amazing work that's been carried out over the last decade. So well done to each one of you for your big and small roles that have been played over the last 10 years. and really looking forward to a bright future for the conservation of the species under Kyle's watch. So great to have a full-time person working to save these wonderful little birds. From my side, everyone, sorry that we haven't been able to get to everybody's questions, but thank you for sending them through. Please feel free to reach out to our panelists if you have any burning questions. All of their contact details are on the BirdLife South Africa website under our Meet the Team page. I'd just like to wish everyone a good evening and make sure that you're all keeping safe out there. Obviously, COVID-19 is taking its toll in South Africa, so please be safe, look after yourselves, and enjoy those birds outside. Make sure you're socially distanced and enjoy the fresh air. From my side, good night. I will see you all again, same time, same place next week, and enjoy those birds outside, everybody. Keep well and good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, panelists.
Bye-bye.